March 14th, 1851. The Arizona Territory. I want you to, just for a second, try to picture it. Put yourself there. But I should warn you, this isn't a movie set I'm taking you to.
No, not at all. It's a place you would never, ever want to be.
Imagine the desert floor. It's late afternoon, so the ground is just radiating that intense, dry heat, but it's quiet. Almost.
Yeah.
Weirdly quiet. The screaming has finally stopped.
The gunfire's over.
Yeah, and all that's left are these few very specific, very harrowing sounds that are just cutting through that silence.
That's the silence of the aftermath, isn't it? That's the moment the reality starts to crash down.
And lying face down in the sand is a young woman. Her name is Marianne Oatman. She's 17. And here's the absolute nightmare part of it. She is fully conscious.
Oh, wow.
She's awake. She can feel the warmth of the sand against her cheeks. She can feel the hot, sticky blood that's matting her hair from where a war club hit her just a few minutes before. She tries to move, to push herself up.
Yeah.
But her body just won't respond.
She's paralyzed by the shock.
Yeah.
By the trauma.
She can't speak, can't scream, but she can hear. She can hear everything.
And what she's hearing is just the total systematic destruction of her world.
She hears her sisters sobbing, Olive, who's 15, and little Marianne, who's only 7. They're crying nearby. And she hears these, heavy footsteps of the warriors, the Tonto Apache, as they're just sorting through the family wagon.
Just tearing everything apart.
Ripping open sacks of flour, smashing crates. And through all that, Marianne knows with this horrible, absolute certainty that her parents are dead. Just a few feet away from her.
She saw it happen. That's the thing. She saw her father's skull crushed. She saw her mother fall right beside him.
So amidst all of that, the heat, the smell of blood, the sound of wood splintering, Marianne has this realization that is maybe the most terrifying part of this whole scene. She knows she's dying.
Right there in the sand.
The lights are going out for her. But her sisters are not dying. They are being pulled to their feet. They're being dragged away.
And that's the moment, isn't it? That split second where their fates just diverge completely. She's leaving this world, but Olive and the 7-year-old, they're being forced into a new one. A much, much darker one.
That moment, lying there, watching your sisters get dragged away into a landscape you don't know by people you don't understand.
Yeah.
That is where we have to start today. Because this isn't just, some frontier ghost story. We're talking about the reality, the brutal, systematic, and honestly very misunderstood reality of Apache captivity.
And we have to be so clear about this right off the bat. This is not the movie version. This is not the John Wayne film you might watch on a Sunday afternoon.
Right.
This isn't that romanticized frontier myth where, the good guys wear white hats and the lines are all drawn very neatly.
We're not doing the cowboys versus Indians caricature.
No. We are looking at a documented, complex, and, a terrifyingly logical system. This was a specific cultural practice during the Apache Wars. It wasn't just random cruelty for the sake of it. It was a structured process. It had stages: selection, breaking, transformation, and reintegration.
And that's really the mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack the why and the how. We'll look at the Oatman sisters, of course. They're the most famous example. And we're also going to bring in others, women like Sarah Ann Horn, Larsina Pennington Page, and even the unnamed women whose minds just shattered under the pressure.
Right. Because the thesis here, and it's a challenging one, is that captivity wasn't chaotic. It was a functional societal tool. It served very specific purposes. And for the women who were caught in it, it was like entering a machine designed to strip away everything they were.
Everything. Your name, your religion, your language.
And turn you into something else entirely.
So let's start with that fundamental question, the why. Because I think for anyone listening to this now, the violence seems so extreme that it feels like madness. Why take captives at all? Why not just kill everyone, take the supplies, and leave?
It is the fundamental question. And to answer it, you really have to step out of our modern way of thinking and look at the world from the Apache perspective in the mid-1800s. We can basically break it down into 5 functional pillars of captive taking. And functional is the key word. This wasn't primarily about sadism. It was about survival.
Okay, 5 pillars. Let's break them down. What's the first one?
The first, and maybe the most important, is demographic replacement. You have to remember, the Apache were in a state of what you could call total war for generations. They were fighting the Mexicans, the encroaching Americans, and other tribes like the Comanche.
So it's a multi-front war with 19th century medicine. I mean, the casualties must have been staggering.
Unbelievably high. And not just from combat. You've got smallpox, measles, starvation. The Apache bands were constantly bleeding people. And if your band loses too many young men, or critically, too many women of childbearing age, the band dies. It's that simple.
So this is literally just about the numbers. It's biological survival.
Precisely. To keep the community going, you have to physically replace the members you lose. And captives, especially women and children, were the raw material for that. If you can take a child, integrate them, make them Apache, you've just secured the future of your band in a way that killing them never could. You're restocking the gene pool.
It's grim, but it's completely logical from that point of view. It's survival math. So once you have the bodies, what's pillar number 2?
Labor and economy. An Apache camp was an economic unit. And running that unit, especially a mobile one in the harsh Southwest, required a tremendous amount of labor.
We're talking a nomadic lifestyle, right? So everything has to be packed up, carried, set up again constantly.
Constantly. And the work is just backbreaking. Processing animal hides, scraping them for hours, gathering food, digging for roots, harvesting mesquite beans, camp maintenance, hauling water, childcare. It's endless.
So a captive becomes a source of free labor, which frees up the actual Apache members of the band for other things.
That's the value proposition, exactly. It freed up Apache women for higher value tasks, and it allowed the warriors to focus completely on what they needed to do, hunting and raiding. So a compliant, hardworking captive was, in essence, a wealth generator. They were an engine that converted labor into survival.
And that leads right into pillar number 3, doesn't it? Because people aren't just labor, they can be commodities, they can be sold.
Trade. This is a huge one. We tend to think of these tribes as isolated, but the Southwest was this massive, interconnected trade network. The Apache were trading with the Comanche, the Navajo, even with Mexicans on the black market. Captives were a form of currency.
So a human being had a literal market value, like a horse or a rifle.
Yes. A captive wasn't just a person. They were an asset that could be exchanged for whatever the band needed most. Horses, weapons, gunpowder, blankets. If your band was rich in captives but poor in horses, you could trade your way to a better position.
That really changes how you see the Oatman girls' situation. When they were taken, their fate wasn't sealed. They weren't necessarily going to stay with that specific group of Tonto Apache.
Not at all. They were, to put it bluntly, money on the hoof. And as we'll see, that's exactly what happens to them. They were liquidated for goods.
Pillar number 4 feels like it shifts from economics to, well, to psychology.
It does. It's psychological warfare and revenge. You really have to try and understand the terror that gripped the frontier settlements. The fear of captivity was often a more powerful weapon than the fear of death.
Because death is over. It's final. But captivity, that's a story without an end.
Exactly. If settlers knew a raid just meant a quick death, they might be more inclined to stand and fight. But knowing that it could mean your wife or your daughter being dragged off into the mountains, maybe never seen again, or worse, being turned, becoming one of them, that fear was visceral.
It would stop you from moving into certain areas. It would change everything.
It shaped settlement patterns. It influenced military decisions. It was a strategic weapon of terror.
And that brings us to the 5th and final pillar, ritual and status. This is more about the internal dynamics of the tribe itself.
Yes. For a warrior, taking a captive was proof of your skill, your prowess, your courage. To successfully ambush a wagon train and come back not just with supplies, but with live prisoners, that elevated your social status within the band. It was a tangible mark of your value as a provider and a protector.
So when the Oatman family was attacked that day, it wasn't just a random act of violence. They were being sized up. The warriors looked at them and saw, well, all 5 pillars: demographics, labor, currency, terror, and status.
It was a calculated harvest. And that brings us right back to the scene of the massacre. We have to look at the selection phase, because not everyone was killed and not everyone was taken. Why did it play out like that? Why kill the parents but keep the girls?
Yeah, let's break that down. The father, Roy's Oatman, he's killed almost immediately with a war club. The mother is killed right after. Why not take them as slaves? They're strong adults.
From the raider's perspective, it's a risk assessment. An adult man is the most dangerous. He's lived his whole life as a free person. He's physically strong. He is very likely to resist, to try and escape, to fight back, maybe even kill a guard in their sleep. He's a high-risk, low-reward asset in that moment.
Okay, so he's too dangerous. What about the mother?
An adult woman, especially one who is clearly bonded to her husband, is also seen as very difficult to break. She's set in her ways, her identity is fully formed, she's far less likely to assimilate, so she's seen as a liability.
And the really young children. The Oatmans had babies and toddlers with them.
This is maybe the hardest part to process. They were killed because they were too young to survive the journey back to the stronghold.
They would slow them down.
Immensely. The Apache moved incredibly fast after a raid. We're talking 40, maybe 50 miles a day over brutal terrain. An infant can't walk. It needs to be carried. It cries and makes noise. It endangers the entire raiding party. So from a purely pragmatic standpoint, they were eliminated.
Which leaves this very specific demographic. Olive, who's 15, and Marianne, who's 7, they're sort of in the Goldilocks zone.
Exactly. They're young enough to be malleable. A 7-year-old's mind is still plastic. She can learn a new language, a new culture. A 15-year-old is old enough to be dominated. But, and this is the key, they're both old enough to walk. They're old enough to work. And as females, they have that long-term value for either integration, breeding, or trade.
But wait, let's go back to Marianne, the 17-year-old we started with. She was in that age range. Why was she left for dead?
Because she was wounded. In that split-second assessment during the attack, she was struck, and she went down. To the warriors, she was damaged goods. If she has a concussion or a broken bone, she can't keep pace on the march. She's not worth the resources to feed and guard if she's just going to die on the trail anyway.
It's just brutal, pragmatic calculation.
It's a chilling efficiency.
So that leads us to the journey. Because surviving the initial attack is just the first filter. The trek back to the Apache camp is the first real test.
And it is a test that is designed to weed out the weak immediately. The moment they're captured, the clock is running. They're bound, usually with rawhide that just cuts into their wrist, and they're forced to march. Instantly.
There's no stopping to rest.
No. They have to put as much distance as possible between themselves and any potential pursuit.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about a hike. This is a forced march, almost a run, over jagged rocks, through cactus fields, up and down steep ravines.
Olive talks about this in her account, right? She describes the pace as just sheer torture.
She does. She said her shoes basically disintegrated on the first day. So she's walking barefoot on volcanic rock and cactus spines. Her feet are just shredded. And the rule was simple. You fall behind, you die. You complain, you die.
And there's that heartbreaking detail about her little sister, Marianne, the 7-year-old. I mean, I just can't imagine a 7-year-old girl who just saw her parents murdered being forced to run through the desert.
It's a miracle she survived the first few hours. Olive realized almost immediately that her little sister just couldn't keep up. Her legs were too short. And she knew what that meant. She could see the warriors looking back, getting impatient.
So what did she do?
Even though she was exhausted and in shock herself, she picked her up. She carried her 7-year-old sister on her back while trying to keep this impossible pace with her own feet bleeding, dehydrated. She knew that if Marianne stopped, even for a second, a warrior would kill her with a lance or a club without a second thought.
So she literally carried her sister to keep her alive.
That act of carrying her is probably the only reason Marianne survived that first week. It's just an unimaginable act of strength.
And this went on for days.
4 days to the initial camp, with almost no food and very little water. And the transformation process starts right there, on the trail. It doesn't wait until they get to the camp.
They stripped them of their American clothes. Why?
Partly practical. You know, a heavy skirt and a bonnet are useless in the brush. They'd give them a simple deerskin garment or a breech clout. But it's also deeply psychological. The stripping of identity starts right away. You don't look like yourself anymore. You're exposed. You're vulnerable.
So you survive the massacre. You survive the death march. You finally arrive at the main camp. The adrenaline is gone. Now what? You're not just welcomed in, right?
No, absolutely not. Now you enter the assessment and breaking phase. When you arrive, there's this evaluation period. The whole tribe comes out to look at you, to judge you.
What are they looking for? Is it like an auction?
In a way, it's a physical and a behavioral exam. Physically, are they healthy? Are they strong? Do they show any signs of disease? But behaviorally, they're testing for submission. Are they defiant? Or are they docile? Do they seem intelligent?
And for the Oatman sisters, this assessment took a long time.
It did. They spent about a year with the Tonto Apache. And the result of that assessment was that they were assigned the status of slaves. They were laborers, they were kept alive, but they were not considered of the people. They were outcasts within the community.
I want to dig into how they actually break a person, because the sources make it sound like a systematic process. It's not just random cruelty. It's closer to what we might call brainwashing today.
It's a methodology, and you see it pretty consistently across different tribes in this period. We can identify 5 specific techniques that were used to dismantle the captive's original identity.
Okay, let's walk through them. Technique number 1.
Physical exhaustion. This is the foundation. You work them until they physically cannot think.
Right.
Sarah Ann Horn, another captive, had this famous quote where she said she was too tired to think.
Right.
If you're hauling wood and water for 16 hours a day on barely any food, you cannot plan an escape. You can't analyze your situation. Your brain just shuts down to its most basic functions. You're just trying to survive the next 10 minutes.
Puts you in a purely reactive survival state. Okay, what's technique 2?
Isolation. You separate captives from each other whenever possible, and you definitely separate them from their culture. You punish them for speaking their own language. If Olive and Marianne were caught speaking English, they would be beaten. The goal is to make them feel utterly alone.
You destroy their social support system, which leads to technique 3, identity destruction.
Exactly. This is where they take your name away. You're no longer Olive. You're given a new Apache name, often a derogatory one. They cut your hair.
And for a Victorian woman, hair was so significant.
It was a huge part of her identity. And for the Apache, cutting hair was also a powerful symbol. They're visually severing your link to your past. And they punish you for any religious expression. We mentioned Larsina Pennington Page earlier.
She was beaten for praying.
Repeatedly.
Yeah.
Any little thing that connected her to her old self, her religion, her language, her habits, was met with pain. They're trying to wipe the hard drive so they can install a new operating system.
And that's where technique 4 comes in. Calibrated violence.
And calibrated is the key word there. The violence is sufficient to create absolute terror and enforce obedience, but not so much that it permanently damages the asset.
You don't want to break the arm of the person you need to scrape hides.
Exactly. You can't cripple your labor force. So you use whips, you use burning sticks, you use starvation. You hurt them enough that they work harder, but not so much that they become useless.
And the last one, technique 5, is the one that feels the most insidious, the most psychological. Intermittent kindness.
This is the most sophisticated part of the whole process. If it was just 100% torture, 100% of the time, the captive's mind would either just shut down or they'd choose to die. But the captors would offer these unpredictable moments of kindness.
Like what, for example?
A small piece of extra food, a moment of rest, a word that isn't a command. A captor who beat you yesterday might smile at you today.
It creates confusion. It keeps them off balance.
It creates what we now call traumatic bonding, or Stockholm Syndrome. The captive's entire world shrinks down to reading the captor's mood. What can I do to please him today? How can I avoid the beating? You start to crave their approval because their approval is the only source of relief in a world of pain. It bonds the victim to the abuser.
So the Oatman sisters are living through this hell for a year, starving, overworked, terrified. But then their story takes another turn.
It does. They get traded. This goes right back to that point about captives being a form of currency. The Tonto Apache were struggling, so they decide to trade the sisters to the Mojave people.
And what was the going rate for 2 human girls?
The records say it was some vegetables, a couple of horses, and some blankets.
Wow.
Just standard trade goods. 2 lives exchanged for some supplies.
So they have to endure another brutal journey, this time to the Colorado River. And life at the Mojave is different, isn't it?
It's a huge shift. The Mojave were more sedentary, more agricultural. They lived in permanent villages in the fertile river valley. And this is where we get the most famous, iconic image from the Oatman story. The blue tattoo.
Right, on the chin. If you look up a picture of Olive Oatman, that's the first thing you see. Those 5 vertical blue lines from her lip down to her chin, it's unforgettable.
It is. And there's a lot of myth around it. People assume it was a slave mark, like a brand. But in Mojave culture, that tattoo, the ki'ichuk, was a spiritual necessity.
What do you mean a necessity?
The Mojave believed that when you died, you needed that mark to be allowed into the land of the dead. Without it, your ancestors wouldn't recognize you, and your spirit would be condemned to wander the desert as a ghost.
So by giving them the tattoo, the Mojave were actually including them. They were saying, we care about your eternal soul.
In a way, yes. It was an act of inclusion. But let's be clear about the process. It was done with cactus spines, pricking the skin over and over until it bled, and then rubbing charcoal into the wounds to create the permanent stain.
That sounds agonizing.
It was incredibly painful. But think about the implication. For a Mojave woman, it's tradition. For Olive and Marianne, it was a permanent physical alteration that marked them forever. It ensured they could never fully go back to white society and just blend in. It was a brand of both ownership and inclusion at the same time.
Now, the 2 sisters experienced this new life very differently, and you mentioned earlier how much age matters in this.
It's crucial. Marianne, the younger sister, is now 8 or 9. She's treated more like an adopted daughter. Her mind is still so plastic that she assimilates very quickly. She learns the language. She starts to forget her old life. She's genuinely becoming Mojave. She even calls the Mojave matriarch Mother.
But Olive is older. He's a teenager. She remembers everything.
Olive is stuck in this ambiguous status. She's not quite a slave anymore, like she was with the Apache. The Mojave treated them much better. But she's not quite a full daughter either. She later described it as being family and property at the same time. There was affection, but she was still owned.
And then, just when things have sort of stabilized, disaster strikes the whole region, a massive drought.
The famine of 1855. It was devastating for everyone. The river didn't flood, the crops failed, the Mojave people themselves were starving to death.
And in any society, during a famine, the social hierarchy becomes brutally clear. Who eats last?
The captives. Even if you're treated like family, when resources are scarce, the tribe protects its own bloodline first.
And this is the end of the road for little Marianne.
Tragically, yes. She was about 11 years old by then. Her small body just couldn't handle the prolonged starvation. She wasted away and died.
There's a really telling detail in the sources about what Olive did next.
There is. Olive was, of course, devastated. But she insisted on burying Marianne, according to her own tradition, the white way, not the Mojave practice of cremation. And the Mojave allowed it. It just shows the strange in-between status she had. She had enough social standing to make that demand and have it respected.
But Olive herself survives the famine.
She does. She's older. She's stronger. But she had also learned to navigate the system. She was savvy. She knew how to forage, who to ask for a scrap of food, how to make herself useful. She had become a survivor.
And finally, in 1856, after 5 total years in captivity, rumors reach Fort Yuma that there's a white woman living with the Mojave. She's ransomed back. She's 20 years old.
And this goes back to what we said at the very beginning. The woman who walked out of that desert was not the girl who was dragged into it. She showed up at the fort wearing a skirt made of bark, covering her face to hide the tattoo. She spoke Mojave fluently, but struggled with English. Her rescuers had no idea what to do with her. She was a stranger to her own people.
I want to pivot here, because Olive's story is the famous one, but she's not the only one. And these other case studies showed just how differently the human mind can react to this kind of trauma.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all experience. It depended on the tribe, the duration, and the individual's own psychology. A great example is Sarah Ann Horn.
Captured in Texas, 1836, by the Comanche.
A very brutal experience. She saw her husband killed right in front of her. But her account gives us one of the earliest and clearest descriptions of what we now call dissociation.
What does she actually describe?
She said that while she was being beaten, she felt like she was floating outside of her own body, watching it happen from a distance. She said she felt no pain, just this detached observation as if it was happening to someone else.
That's a classic trauma defense mechanism. The mind just splits itself off to survive something unbearable.
It does. Her mind protected itself by leaving her body. But the long-term cost was enormous. She eventually returned to society, but she was haunted. Nightmares, a crippling fear of loud noises, an inability to form relationships. It's basically a perfect 19th century description of severe PTSD.
Then you have someone who took the exact opposite approach. Larsina Pennington Page. She was the resistor.
Larsina is fascinating. She was captured in 1860 and only held for about a month, but she fought them every single step of the way. She refused to answer to her new name. She refused to stop speaking English. She resisted working.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was. She was beaten constantly for it, stabbed with lances. Eventually, they got so fed up with her defiance that they threw her over a cliff and left her for dead.
And she survived that.
She did. She crawled for 16 days back to civilization. But her story shows something important. The grim takeaway is that her resistance didn't really change her situation. It only increased the level of pain she suffered. The work still had to be done. And even that short 1-month captivity left her with lifelong physical scars.
And then, at the complete opposite end of that spectrum, you have the case of Francesca Johnson.
Assimilated. And this is the story that really complicates the simple victim narrative. She was a Mexican woman captured by the Lipan Apache around 1843. She was held for 11 years.
So she spent her entire young adulthood with them.
Her formative years, yes. So when the U.S. military rescued her in 1854, they found a woman who spoke fluent Apache and could barely remember her Spanish. But more than that, she had built a life. She had an Apache husband. She had 3 Apache children.
So for her, the rescue wasn't a rescue at all.
It was a catastrophe. Imagine soldiers bursting into your home and dragging you away from your children, claiming they're saving you. She fought them. She screamed. She had to be physically restrained. For years after being returned to her Mexican family, she tried to escape to get back to her Apache family.
That's just heartbreaking. For her, the rescue was a second kidnapping, a second trauma.
Exactly. It shows that for long-term captives, what we call rescue could be just another violent tearing away of family and identity.
We've talked about survivors, resistors, and the assimilated, but there's a darker category. The sources mention an unnamed woman at Fort Buchanan in 1858.
This is the hardest one to talk about. This is the case of total psychological collapse. The surgeon's report from the fort is just chilling. He wrote that she was in a state of complete mental derangement.
What did that look like in practice?
She couldn't speak. She had lost intelligible language entirely. She would just alternate between these fits of violent agitation, screaming, thrashing, and then periods of total catatonic passivity, where she would just stare at a wall for hours.
So her mind it broke. The whole structure failed.
It shattered. The trauma, the identity stripping, the terror, it was simply too much for her psyche to bear. The 19th century doctors called it derangement. Today we'd recognize it as a complete psychotic break induced by extreme trauma. She was sent to an asylum in Santa Fe, and then she just vanishes from the historical record.
We don't even know her name.
No name, no grave, nothing. She's a reminder that not everyone survives. The plucky heroine narrative is a myth. Captivity was a meat grinder, and some people were just destroyed by it.
So let's talk about the aftermath for those who did come back, like Olive. You return, but you're marked. Literally, you have that tattoo on your face.
The physical markers were the most obvious challenge. You can't hide a blue tattoo on your chin in polite Victorian society. People stared. She was a curiosity, a spectacle. But beyond the physical, there was the social reception.
I imagine it was complicated.
Ambivalence is the perfect word. On one hand, society saw them as victims, they were objects of pity, but on the other hand, there was this deep, dark suspicion, what we call the pollution narrative.
Explain that. What were people suspicious of?
There were all these unspoken questions. Was she sexually violated? Did she have children with them? Did she, on some level, enjoy it? Did she go native? In the strict Victorian moral code, a woman's virtue was everything. A woman who had been among savages, even against her will, was considered tainted.
So you're both a victim and a suspect at the same time.
Precisely. Olive co-authored a famous book about her experience, but it was heavily filtered through the lens of a male pastor. It presents her as this perfect Christian martyr who hated the Apache every single second. The reality was probably much, much more complex than that.
She went on a lecture tour for a while, didn't she?
She did. She would stand on stage and tell her story, show her tattoo, but she eventually withdrew from public life. She married a rancher, but they never had children. And here's the most telling detail. After she died, her husband burned all of her personal papers.
Wow. He erased her private thoughts. Why?
We can only speculate. But the most likely theory is that she never fully reconciled the two halves of her life. She kept the tattoos. She probably maintained some connection to her Mojave life that her husband and her society just couldn't handle. Burning the papers was a way to purify her memory, to erase the part of her that wasn't white anymore.
Before we wrap this up, we have to zoom out one last time. We've spent this whole time talking about what the Apache did, and it is brutal. But this didn't happen in a vacuum?
No, absolutely not. It's critical to see this in the context of a total war. The Apache were not just perpetrators of violence, they were also victims of it. They were subjected to massacres, forced relocations, and official scalp bounties.
Scalp bounties, that was a real government policy.
It was. In both Mexico and some U.S. territories, governments paid cash for Apache scalps, man, woman, or child. It was a state-sponsored campaign of extermination. Apache people who were captured by whites or Mexicans were also enslaved or killed.
So it was a cycle of violence begetting more violent.
It was a cycle of extreme, unforgiving violence on all sides. The Apache were fighting for their very existence against a technologically superior and numerically overwhelming force. The women we've talked about today, Olive, Sarah, Larsena, they were caught in the collision of these two grinding forces.
Collateral damage in a clash of civilizations.
That's exactly what they were.
This has been incredibly heavy, but so important. As we close out, I just want to go back to those individuals one last time. Marianne dying in the sand, Olive with her tattoos, Sarah watching her own body from above, Francesca being torn away from her children, that unnamed woman just staring at a wall in an asylum.
We have to remember them as people, not just statistics in a history book. Their stories show us the absolute extremes of human adaptability, but also of human fragility.
And it leaves me with one final thought for everyone listening. We all like to think we know who we are, Our identity feels so solid. It's our name, our job, our family. But if all of that was stripped away,
If you were stripped of your name, your language, your clothes, your entire family, if you were forced to become someone else just to survive, who would you be when you came back?
and would you ever really come back?
I don't think so. I don't think you ever could. Not all of you.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Take care.